Welcome to A Holy Calling, a teaching ministry of Don Minkler which focuses especially on the great doctrines of the faith, having a special focus and desire to encourage fellow ministers in their calling and to equip students of the Word in the great doctrines of the faith. I'm your host, Jim Minkler, who along with my brother Don Minkler, who is also my brother in the Lord, am thankful for this opportunity to present this ministry before you today. Today we begin the first of a two-part series on revealing creation and exposing evolution. And Don, I've heard you speak on the topic of creation and evolution before, and I've always enjoyed such times. And brother, of course, I know that your heart for A Holy Calling Ministries is the proclamation of the great doctrines of the faith, both in order to equip and to embolden others in their sphere of influence for Christ. So explain why we set aside this, and Lord willing, the next broadcast, to deal in a great measure with the scientific evidence on the subject of creation and evolution.
Well, as you know, Jim, first I'd like to say that the consideration of creation and evolution is not at all unrelated to the consideration and proclamation of the great doctrines of the faith. It's a fit subject for pastors and teachers and students of the Word to consider. For the lie of evolution dares to exalt itself against the knowledge of God, and its arguments need to be cast down and exposed. Because for some, no doubt, the theory of evolution is used as an excuse for never considering the accountability we have before God, the value of our immortal souls, and the hope of salvation held out to all through the gospel. Evolution is a big and powerful and dangerous lie which needs to be exposed, and in general, our culture, and sadly that includes many even within the walls of the church, is completely unaware of just how inundated we are with evolutionary teaching. In fact, indoctrination is the word. Even from kindergarten up, our society is schooled in the hypothesis of evolutionary assumptions, such as dinosaur timelines and supposed bestial, irrational cavemen, and their claims concerning the fossil record and so forth. And with the acceptance of evolutionary assumption, there follows a natural planting of seeds for the rejection of the claims of God upon the soul of man. And this makes it a subject worthy of our attention to address from the pulpit.
Definitely. Our children really are susceptible to the indoctrination of the very dangerous teachings of evolution. Dangerous, for the heart of the teaching presents an atheistic philosophy of life, and Satan is, of course, the great architect of the promotion, the indoctrination of this lie. Well, knowing that we've got a lot to cover today, let's get right to the lesson, the first half of a two-part series on revealing creation and exposing evolution.
There at the top of your notes, our starting text, Hebrews 11:3. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. I heard of a college professor who would start his class by writing on the board, "Evolution is a fact, get over it." Is evolution a fact? Absolutely not. The theory of evolution is an unproven hypothesis, and it's one that's full of many serious problems. Anyone who speaks of this molecules to man evolution as if it were a fact is either ignorant upon the matter or he's willfully misrepresenting the truth. There is no empirical evidence, no smoking gun evidence for this theory, and to the contrary, there is much scientific evidence against the theory. But such intellectual intimidation tactics in order to try to bully people into believing the theory as a fact is something we can expect to run into. In fact, we're just constantly bombarded. We're actually being indoctrinated by the theory, whether we know it or not. National Geographic, Discovery-type shows and magazines all speak about and present evolution as if it were just simply a proven fact. Now, that's not to say that a person cannot personally be convinced that the theory is true, but he crosses a line of falsehood, whether intentionally or not, when he states to others that evolution is a proven fact. Now, first off, what is meant by evolution? You'll find various definitions, but in general, that life began from non-living matter, and through a process of mutations and natural selection over time, more complex living organisms are in descent from a single cell beginning. Now, if you look at the chart that we have there in your notes, evolutionary change, you'll notice at the bottom the arrow saying time, and you'll see the different divisions in it. You'll recognize some of those divisions, the Precambrian, the Cambrian, go a little higher up on that, the Jurassic you'll see. And over on the right side, you'll see the categories that are the end results thus far, according to evolution, which fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, man. And you'll notice that these branches go out and they all start from a single beginning, a single cell. And though there are branches that stop, dead branches, there are also, from various points of divergence, branches that go on to higher complexity until we have the categories over on the right side of the chart. Also, the categories in your next illustration with pictures: man, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish. This is your basic plan of evolutionary change. And again, in general, evolution is defined as the belief that life began from non-living matter and through a process of mutations and natural selection over time, new and more complex living organisms descended from a simple single-cell beginning. Now, clearly, evolution must be classified as a hypothesis. For concerning non-living matter becoming living matter, this has not been observed either in nature or in the laboratory. Now, you might hear someone attempt to blur the lines between living matter and non-living matter by speaking about the necessary building blocks for life being present, but that's an unproven hyperjump to say that life has evolved from non-living matter. I mean, you can have all the building blocks for life present in a mortuary and a corpse, but it's still a hyperjump to life, even though you pile such building blocks up. Therefore, consider what we know about the scientific law of biogenesis versus the theory of spontaneous generation. Now, perhaps you recall from your junior high school science class how the discovery of the law of biogenesis destroyed the once popular theory of spontaneous generation. In its more crude form, spontaneous generation was the belief that mosquitoes came from stagnant water, mice from old cheese left lying around, flies from decaying meat, and so forth. Now, of course, we know that these things do not spontaneously come from these things, but rather that mosquitoes lay their eggs in stagnant water, mice come looking for cheese, and flies lay their eggs in meat, and so forth and so on. Now, scientists, we expect for the most part, didn't accept such crude forms of spontaneous generation, yet in its more sophisticated forms, such as mold appearing on bread and bacteria forming on meat, it seemed to give to the scientific community evidence to the belief in a scientific principle of spontaneous generation, that life came from non-living matter. But by brilliant, observable, repeatable experiments, in other words, by true science, Louis Pasteur, from which we get the process of pasteurization, proved that spontaneous generation was false. That when food was cleansed of microorganisms and completely protected from microorganisms in the air, then it would not spoil, it wouldn't produce mold. In short, living organisms, be it mold, flies, mosquitoes, mice, or men, will not be produced, which, no matter how you slice it, is the very basis for the theory of evolution. Spontaneous generation, life coming from non-living matter, even though science says such is not possible. Now that's quite the problem for the evolutionist who's committed to the basic principle of evolution, that life comes from non-living matter. For evolutionists agree that there's only two possibilities. Either life came from non-living matter, that is, spontaneous generation, or life came from an act of supernatural creation. And that there cannot be a third option is plain to all. Now, what a position for the committed evolutionist to be in. For he must either believe in spontaneous generation, which has been proven to be false by true science, or he must believe in an act of divine creation. So what does the evolutionist choose to believe in? Though he might blush a little and say it with a muffled or with bated breath, when push comes to shove and you corner them, the evolutionist is forced to admit that he believes in spontaneous generation. Confront the evolutionist with the plain fact that his favorite theory is outside of what science has revealed, and he'll be forced to resort to theorizing upon his theory that there must be an exception to the law of biogenesis that we just haven't found yet. Or resort to theorizing upon his theory that there may have been a time in the distant past when the laws of science didn't work. Clearly, the theory is unproven. But suggest to him that it's not the law of biogenesis that needs to be done away with, but his unscientific theory of evolution, and you'll probably hear something much like that of what D.M.S. Watson said. Evolution, this is in your notes there, evolution is a theory universally accepted, not because it can be proved to be true, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly impossible. Now let me translate that for you. What he's saying basically is that even though the facts are against it, we know that evolution must be true because the idea of creation is clearly impossible. Obviously, they're not going to follow the evidence wherever the evidence leads. Obviously, there are many committed evolutionists who are just like that, who are not the least bit interested in where the evidence of science points. They're only interested in removing the possibility of, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So don't let anybody intimidate you with such forceful talk, such intimidating talk as if evolution were a fact. Now, where the law of biogenesis contradicts evolution, consider how it agrees with the biblical account of creation, of in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There in your notes, Genesis 1:11-12. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit, according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And then also there in your notes, Genesis chapter 1, verse 21 and verse 24. So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird, according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the earth bring forth, verse 24 now, then God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature, according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so. Notice the basic principle revealed here in creation is that each creation is according to its kind, whose seed is in itself, and this agrees with the law of biogenesis. And this we're going to see as we proceed a little bit more on this in a moment. Because this is a powerful principle, especially when we get into considering DNA. But someone says, well, just skip all this talk about biogenesis. The proof of evolution is found in the fossil record. No, it's not. And if evolution were true, we would find the proof in the fossil record. That's a very false assumption that many people are under, that the proof of evolution is found in the fossil record. Instead, in the fossil record, we find fish, we find frogs, we find dogs, we find bats. What we don't find, though, are these interlinking creatures that are supposed to be there, those little lines drawn to the charts of evolutionists, of one animal to the other. All we've got are lines. We don't have these transitional forms, despite the outlandish claims on unsound and scanty fragmentary evidence that evolutionists have made. And we'll cover this evidence in a little bit that they've put forth. But understand that if there were proof in the fossil record of evolution, then we would have, between fish and frogs in the fossil record, millions of half fish, half frog slowly evolving. We would have more prototypes of this fishy froggy creature than we would have of the finished products of a fish and a frog. But this is not what the fossil record reveals. I like what William Jennings Bryan said. He said, no one has ever been able to trace one single species to another. Darwin admitted that no species had ever been traced to another, but he thought his hypothesis should be accepted even though the missing links had not been found. If there is such a thing as evolution, it is not just one link, the link between man and lower forms of life that is missing, but all the millions of links between millions of species, an infinite number of links between each two species, or 1,000,000 times 1,000,000 links in all, every one of which is missing. And we're talking about between a fish and a frog, and those are missing. What should we do if we talk about what evolutionists say about killer whales and dolphins, these sea-dwelling, air-breathing mammals, which they believe have come from some four-footed land-dwelling mammal that decided to go back in the water and evolve? Can you imagine the cajillions of creatures that would have to exist between, say, a cow and a killer whale? Can you imagine the fossil record not having any evidence of these things and evolution being true? Darwin himself really understood this problem, and he wrote, this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties which formerly existed be truly enormous. Why, then, is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against this theory. And since Darwin wrote that, the problem hasn't changed. Clearly, if evolution were true, the proof would be found in the fossil record. But instead, to the frustration of committed evolutionists, the fossil record gives only evidence of the principle behind creation, of every kind after its own kind, whose seed is in itself. So what do they do when they don't have proof for these various creatures that were supposed to have existed? One of the ways they try to fix that is they speak about gaps in the fossil record. There's just some things that are missing. Things that are missing. Now that's putting it really mildly. There ought to be more of these prototypes. I like what McDowell and Stewart said. What right does science have to fill these gaps with imaginary animals for which there's not the slightest evidence of their existence? The answer to that question is they have no right. Douglas Dewar, a British naturalist and described as a once ardent evolutionist, said, It's in your notes there. The fossil record cannot be regarded as other than a hostile witness against evolution. The earliest known fossils of each class and order are not half developed, but have all the essential characteristics of their class and order. Clearly, the fossil record does not support this slow, gradual evolution. The shift of some, then, has been to a theory that's taught now called punctuated equilibria. And that's the belief, basically, that at punctuated times in history, great changes of some sort took place within a species in as little as hundreds of years and then evened out and remained that way for millions of years. Basically, it's a theory to explain why the fossil record doesn't support evolution. I like what Lubenow said in his book, Bones of Contention. He said, it's imperative to emphasize that the punctuated equilibrium model does not remove the need for transitional fossils. It just explains why those transitions have not been found. Certainly, the punctuated equilibria theory is unique. It must be the only theory ever put forth in the history of science which claims to be scientific, but then explains why evidence for it cannot be found. Now, the result of this is that evolutionists have this position where they have all these theories to draw from, so that they're telling us two contradictory things. Saying first that the evolutionary change happens so slowly, so gradually, that you can't notice it. Then when someone points out to them that there's no evidence for this slow, gradual change in the fossil record, they say, well, that's because it happened so quickly in punctuated leaps that it didn't have time to leave evidence. One can't help but wonder if people haven't been put in straitjackets for less nonsensical talk than that. The theory of evolution is not good science. It is not supported by the evidence of the fossil record, but rather the theory is kept alive by inventing theories to keep the theory alive. But someone says, but what about all the ape-men fossils? If you take a look at your notes there, you'll see an illustration of the supposed evolution of man. Charts like this are put before our eyes, and we're supposed to see this and just fold and say, oh, it makes so much sense. You see also there another illustration of Marcelian Buell shown there, who made popular the image of the bestial, irrational man, a creature somewhere between ourselves and apes, Neanderthal. And in case you're wondering, Marcelian Buell's the one on the right wearing clothes. Evidence from the ape men. Does it exist? Not at all. Consider the trail of failed evidence given for the descent of man from these irrational ape-like ancestors. Now, no doubt the most infamous one is Piltdown Man. This fossil find was in Piltdown, England, discovered by Charles Dawson in a gravel pit, and it stirred the attention of the world for some 40 years. Presented as if it were the missing link that the science community had been looking for. The fossil had the skull of a man with the lower jawbone of an orangutan. Now, clearly, this is evidence of evolution. This is exactly what evolutionists were expecting to find. However, the fossil turned out to be a fraud, a hoax, a phony fossil planted by someone. It's not apparently clear who, but there's some suspects. Lubenow writes of this account and says, and it's in your notes there, the lower jaw was that of a juvenile female orangutan. The place where the jaw would articulate with the skull had been broken off to hide the fact that it did not fit the skull. The teeth of the mandible were filed down to match the teeth of the upper jaw, and the canine tooth had been filed down to make it look heavily worn. There were elements about it that were quite obvious. The file marks on the orangutan teeth of the lower jaw were clearly visible. The molars had been misaligned and filed at two different angles. The canine tooth had been filed down so far that the pulp cavity had been exposed and then plugged. Now, yet during the next 40 years, this was held as the missing link, the empirical proof, the smoking gun evidence that evolution is true. And who knows how many countless people bought into it at that time. Likewise, consider Hesperopithecus. And if it's easier to say, you can call a Nebraska man. Hesperopithecus. Now, whereas Piltdown Man was intentional fraud, Hesperopithecus must be labeled as gross error. And yet, he was also put forth as smoking gun evidence of Darwin's evolutionary theory. Hesperopithecus came with all the wonderful imagination of reconstruction, of an artist's rendering of what the man looked like. And what was the evidence that was found? A tooth. Henry Fairfield Osborne, director of the American Museum of Natural History, received a tooth in the mail sent to him by field geologist Harold Cook, who was inquiring what sort of a creature this tooth belonged to. The tooth was examined and announced to be the evidence of man evolving from ape-like creatures that evolutionists have been waiting for. Because of the importance of the discovery, expeditions were organized to find more evidence of this missing creature, figuring, hey, if we found the tooth, let's do a little more digging and why not find the whole ape man? Which they did. But Hesperopithecus turned out not even to be anywhere close to the artist's rendering. Hesperopithecus turned out to be a pig. There in your notes from Josh McDowell and Don Stewart's book, Reasons Skeptics Should Consider Christianity. Hellman and Gregory argued over whether the tooth was more ape-like or human. Professor Wilder published a book claiming that Nebraska man, Hesperopithecus, was halfway between Java man and Neanderthal man. Elliot Smith wrote a short article on Mr. and Mrs. Hesperopithecus, including a reconstruction of what they looked like. And all the discovery created quite a sensation for a period of 4.5 years. Hesperopithecus, it turned out, was a peccary, a wild pig. Then consider Zinjanthropus, or East Africa man. This was at the very least overeager heir. This was a discovery made by the Leakeys, Lewis and Mary, in which Lewis is quoted in National Geographic as saying, "The teeth were projecting from the rock face, smooth and shining, quite obviously human." However, this quite obviously human evidence was later revealed as not human. Yet, again, included in the article was an artist's rendering of what this creature looked like, the skill of the artist being such that the portrait seemed to the uninformed irrefutable smoking gun evidence. After it all, it appears in a highly respected magazine. The great skill of the artist and the ability of the Leakeys to present this to National Geographic resulted in who knows how many multitudes of readers becoming convinced of what is only another example of evolutionary evidence gone bad. Likewise, Rampithecus. For years, upon what Lubenow called the flimsiest of evidence, David Pilbeam of Harvard University convinced his fellow paleoanthropologists until more fossil evidence was found and it became obvious that Rampithecus had nothing to do with human origin. But again, not until the field of paleoanthropology had swallowed Rampithecus first. Likewise, the so-called indisputable evidence for Lucy began to disintegrate. Also, Rhodesia man, Java man, Peking man, none of these things give smoking gun evidence at all. The trail of evidence for evolutionaries' ape men is a joke. And yet, people are convinced of the theory of evolution upon its evidence. Incredible. A point in case, last one here, we'll look at Neanderthal man. When we think of Neanderthal man, we think of big, ugly, stooped over, hairy, clumsy Neanderthal man. And it's been said that we have an overzealous paleontologist to thank for that, and that's Marcelian Buell. Yet anyone who looks into the facts knows that it's again a great embarrassment to the field of paleoanthropology. Bull constructed Neanderthal in a way that gave this man an apish look, apish characteristics. But after 44 years, the work that Bull, who was a famous paleontologist at the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, his work began to be critically examined again. In your notes there from Bones of Contention, Bull decided that this man could not extend his legs fully, but walked with a bent knee gait. He made the foot only slightly arched, resting on its outer edge, with toes pointing in. Hence, the man would have walked like an ape, pigeon-toed. Bull formed a wide separation between the big toe and the other toes, making the big toe like an opposable thumb, such as monkeys and apes have. Under these conditions, if Neanderthal man walked at all, he would have looked like a shuffling hunchback. His center of gravity was located so far forward on his center of support that he probably would have fallen flat on his face. We wish that we could say that Bull was rather unsophisticated and that he made sincere mistakes. That would be the kinder explanation. However, he was world-renowned for his abilities. It is difficult to escape the conclusion that his errors were deliberate. Now consider that, 44 years before the original mistakes of Neanderthal were corrected. But then again, it was another 20 years before the display was corrected in the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, and I don't know how many other museums might have kept the display. In fact, I think today you'd still find people who are still putting forward this whole concept, this erroneous idea, this unfair presentation of Neanderthal. So keep that in mind when you come across a magazine article in Time or National Geographic or U.S. News and World Report, an article with an artistic rendering of an overzealous imagination from an evolutionist of this supposed proof. It still happens. It still goes on. And understand that in the field of science, not only are there no undisputed empirical evidence for ape-men fossils, but these drawings and things are even an embarrassment to other evolutionists who are embarrassed by the things, the claims, the wild claims that are made. And yet, while the media outlet is quick to put that out there as this is proof for evolution, and the indoctrination continues. I love what George Barry O'Toole said, who served as professor of animal biology at Seton Hill College, and nothing has changed in the years past since he said this. In your notes there, so far as science knows, only one human species has ever existed on the earth, and that is Homo sapien. All alleged connecting links between men and apes are found on careful examination to be illusory. When not wholly ambiguous in view of their inadequate preservation and fragmentary character, they are, as regards both mind and body, distinctly human, like Neanderthal man, or they are purely simian, like Pithecanthropus, or they are heterogeneous combinations of human and simian bones. In spite of tireless searching, no traces of a bestial, irrational man have been discovered. Also there in your notes from W. Howells, Harvard, Mankind So Far, the quote, "A great legend has grown up to plague both paleontologists and anthropologists. It is the one of men can take a tooth or a small broken piece of bone, gaze at it and pass his hand over his forehead once or twice, and then take out a sheet of paper and draw a picture of what the whole animal looked like. If this were quite true, the anthropologist would make the FBI look like a troop of Boy Scouts. And truly, neither the FBI nor anthropologists nor paleontologists can take a few scrap of bones and teeth and be able to tell you that this guy was 5'2", eyes of blue, 185 pounds, had a 200 bowling average, and loved juicy fruit gum. They cannot do that. Scientists' great claims of evolutionary proof are based on the flimsiest of evidence. A tooth made into an ape man, a few broken fragments, or a skull plate here, or a little piece of it, make a whole caveman. A bit of bone here and a bit of bone there, piece it together, and you got a monstrosity colored in with skin and hair and the imaginations of an artist with an equally creative evolutionist pushing him behind, and you've got proof for Darwinian macroevolution. But if evolution were true, this planet would be teeming with proof. Now, this is not to say that you cannot find in every biology textbook pictures of fossilized material that are claimed to be transitional forms. But concerning the handful of fossils that are touted as evidence, they fail the very first test of numbers, in spite of the sorry attempts of punctuated equilibria evolutionists who speak in such a way as to try to explain away why the evidence is missing to begin with. Indeed, there just simply is not evidence for these transitional forms that must be there. But someone says, but suppose we were able to find 50 skulls, not a handful of bits and bones and teeth and whatnot. What if we found 50 skulls of unusual shape? Now this would be empirical evidence for evolution, would it not? Not at all. There was a tribe that would wrap the heads of their babies of nobility in such a way that their skulls would grow all their life to be cone-shaped. Does that prove evolution if we find a cone-shaped baby or man? What if a fossil of a hunched-over man? Isn't that evidence we were evolving and learned how to straighten up? Not at all. We have hunchbacks living among us today. But what if we found thousands upon thousands of people with tiny little feet, fossilized? Would not that prove that the last thing to evolve in man was the foot? No, the Chinese have wrapped the feet of their women to make their feet very small. I saw a picture of a woman. It wasn't very appealing to me. She had her neck covered with gold rings, and from her shoulder blades up, it made her neck look like it was 3 times the length of anybody else's neck. It was not very pleasant for my eyes to behold. I'm sure it was pretty in her culture. But suppose some overeager evolutionist should stumble on this fossilized girl someday. Will this not be evidence that we evolved from giraffes? Of course not. Likewise, with a handful of fragments and these hard-to-explain bits and pieces, there is not found any smoking gun evidence for the theory at all. The theory of evolution survives by theories being placed upon theories. We, however, by faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. Amen.
what a need exists that the lie of evolution be exposed. It certainly has the evidence of Satan's promotion, a theory which not only reduces the individual's worth for all practical purposes down to zero, except for perhaps a slim chance of whatever minor and unconscious contribution one might happen to make in passing along a hopeful mutation to the gene pool in one's offspring, but as well, it removes the need for moral accountability to God, and both of these have Satan's mark upon them. Don, what would you say to the pastor who's listening today and wondering whether or not he should speak upon this subject of evolution before his congregation?
Well, Jim, I do believe that it's something that the minister should at least in some measure address before his congregation. And I don't mean to imply that it has to be an in-depth presentation, but the lie of it must be exposed and cast down. And it doesn't take much to expose evolution as an unproven hypothesis, one which stands contrary to known laws of science, and one that's gained much of its popular notoriety today on fraudulent evidence from the past. Our objective, of course, must not be to win an intellectual argument, but to rescue souls from damnation. It matters that we cast down the strongholds and arguments of evolution which dare to exalt itself against the knowledge of God, because souls are at stake, and evolution does keep souls from hearing the gospel. Consider the sad situation of Sir Arthur Keith, who is quite possibly the man who was most deceived by the phony fossil Piltdown Man. Keith has been called one of the greatest anatomists of the 20th century, of whom it's said that over the 40 years of the Piltdown Man fraud, though much writing was produced on Piltdown Man, it's been said that Keith wrote more than anyone else. And listen to what Marvin Lubenow writes in his excellent book, Bones of Contention, of Keith, who was 86 years old when Oakley and Wiener called on him at his home to break the news that the fossil held as evidence for evolution for 40 years was no more than a fraud. And this is from page 44 of Lubenow's book, and he writes, Keith was a rationalist, a pronounced opponent of the Christian faith. Yet in his autobiography, he tells of attending evangelistic meetings in Edinburgh and Aberdeen, seeing students make a public profession of faith in Jesus Christ, and often feeling on the verge of conversion. He rejected the gospel because he felt that the Genesis account of creation was just a myth, and that the Bible was merely a human book. It causes profound sadness to know that this great man rejected Jesus Christ, whose resurrection validated everything he said and did, only to put his faith in what proved to be a phony fossil. Marvin Lubenow.
Wow, that's powerful.
Now, no one knows who pulled the prank of Piltdown Man. The names of 6 suspects that have been raised behind the prank can be found in Lubenow's book, including Keith's name, which seems to me, however, unlikely, but it really doesn't matter who pulled the prank. What does matter is that it fooled not just the scientific world, but the world at large for 4 decades, and caused who knows how many multitudes of people to embrace evolution as true, people that lived and died and entered eternity lost during that time. And if Lubenow's summary is correct, and Piltdown Man influenced or at least confirmed Keith in his continued rejection of Jesus Christ, then consider that that is just the tip of the iceberg. Think of how many people lived and died in that 40-year period, convinced that evolution now had smoking gun evidence. It's a horrible thought to consider how many souls were influenced against the gospel during that time, as well as the number of souls today who believe in evolution because of the gain the theory of evolution had in universities the world over during that time period, a hold which continues today even though the fossil was a phony. And this makes it important that we boldly proclaim the truth of creation, the truth that we must all stand before the Creator in Judgment Day, and the truth that unless one is reconciled to Him through Jesus Christ, such a one will spend an eternity in hell.
Wow, this definitely needs to be exposed and cast down. Don, I know all throughout the delivering of the series you were greatly pressed for time and had to be extremely selective in what you shared because of the time restraints. And since we have a little time left today here at the close of the broadcast, we're going to give you the time to address some of those things you didn't have time to address during the lesson.
Thanks, Jim. One of those things that I want to point out is that evolution has gained a lot of groundwork through their marvelous artwork. Not science work, but artwork. Some of the best propaganda for their theory centers around their artwork of their evolutionary charts, from which one is supposed to just look at it and just accept that mankind must have evolved from common ape-like ancestors. After all, apes in many ways look so close to humans. Now, of course, besides pointing out the lack of real evidence for these supposed ape men, we need to point out that similarities in other creatures doesn't mean a common evolutionary cousin at all. For example, a shark and a dolphin appear very similar, yet according to the theory of evolution, a shark being a fish and a dolphin being an air-breathing mammal, well, they're about as far away from one another as you can get on the imaginary scheme of evolution, and yet they are similar in their looks. Likewise, a platypus, which has webbed feet and a duck bill, but which is a mammal, is far away, even in an evolutionary sense, from a duck, which is a fowl. So the next time someone points out the beautiful artwork of an evolutionary chart as if it were just common sense evidence, you can point out that similarities or traits, even according to evolution's definition, doesn't give proof of being related. Now it must be asked, aside from the fact that those who earnestly believe in evolution want to find empirical evidence for their theory, one might ask, how could a brilliant man like Sir Arthur Keith miss the obvious fraud in Piltdown Man? Well, he more than likely never got the chance to even see the actual fossil and examine it, for then he would have plainly seen the file marks and the other plainly fraudulent marks about it. Lubenow, again, in his excellent book Bones of a Contention, reveals how. He states that most anthropologists who teach human evolution in our universities have never even seen an original human fossil. The reason is that the fossils are extremely delicate. The teeth can shatter at the slightest impact. Chunks of bones may flake off by a scratch of a fingernail, since some of the material is not completely replaced by inorganic materials. Therefore, paleontologists work with plaster cast of the original, meaning then that their authoritative statements they make depend greatly on the quality of the cast of the fossils, yet are these reproductions reliable? In 1984, when the American Museum exhibition had fossils brought together for a carefully protected display, casts of the originals were given to the museum ahead of time so that the mounts could be made to hold the original fossil material when they arrived. But when the original fossils were placed in those mounts, most of them did not fit. Now here's the point I want to make from this. In a field where some overeager zealous evolutionists have tried to make a whole man out of a tooth, and since casts vary from the originals that greatly in more than half of the mounts, how wrong is this picture when these evolutionary statements are not even made on the actual evidence to begin with? To quote from Lubenau's book again, he writes, "Since the original fossils are virtually beyond access even to those who teach in the field of paleoanthropology, and only a few of them are available as reproductions, and reproductions are not recommended in the preparation of scientific papers, and those scientific papers themselves cannot adequately convey differences between fossils, paleoanthropology seems to have a problem. Paleoanthropology is in the awkward position of being a science which is at least one step removed from the very material upon which it claims to base its finds." Marvin Lubenow. Well, that's a powerful quote. As well, before we close, let me quickly touch on dinosaurs, for dinosaurs are no problem for the creationist. For we know that the land-dwelling animals were created on day 6 of creation, and that they lived at the same time that man lived. And the claims of millions of years ago, no matter how many times they're repeated, are clearly ridiculous, and the evidence against such claims are powerful. Ken Ham points out that the name dinosaur was not even invented, was not even coined until 1841 by Sir Richard Owen, that he coined the term from Greek words meaning terrible lizard. Now, since the word dinosaur was not invented until 1841, we'd have to look into history for other names by which people refer to these creatures. Now consider the description given of an animal from Job chapter 40, verse 15, which was completely contemporary with man living then. And it reads, "Look now at Behemoth, which I have made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword." Now clearly, this creature described resembles perfectly what we know of dinosaurs. Although not called a dinosaur, again because the name dinosaur hadn't even been invented until 1841, what other animal could this be but a dinosaur? And immediately, Brontosaurus comes to mind. However, that's a wrong name for it now. Ken Ham rightly pointed out that no living creature today comes near this description, but this description given of Behemoth in Job is very much like the vegetation eater Brachiosaurus, a 30-ton creature with its head towering some 40 feet off the ground as it walked. Now, notice again what's said of this animal that God describes in Job, which was contemporary with man, which I made along with you, God says. He eats grass like an ox. His strength is in his hips. His power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. His sinews are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze. Now, some have tried to say that this animal is an elephant or a hippopotamus. Now, that is clearly ridiculous. For one thing, it's plain that a hippo, with its little tiny flap of skin of a tail, could never be the animal Behemoth whose tail is like a cedar tree, nor could it be an elephant with its little rope-like tail. Also concerning dinosaurs, we know that the world abounds with stories of dragons, and no doubt of great hunters who made a name for themselves by killing a dragon, and that these dragons resemble dinosaurs is all too plain. Now, over time, we would expect the stories to turn into myth, but nevertheless, we would expect an element of history to be found in some form in these very many legends about dragons. It would seem to have at least some basis of fact regarding the multitude of stories of such great creatures that were hunted by mighty hunters, perhaps to extinction. For example, we know that there was a time in American history when the land was abundant in buffaloes, and yet they were almost completely hunted to extinction by would-be mighty hunters. And one can see that it would be very natural for the same thing to have happened with dinosaurs. Ken Ham has a little booklet out on dinosaurs, and it gives accounts in history, including a reference to a European scientific book from the 1500s, which he says lists several animals that we would call dinosaurs today, and also how there are petroglyphs, drawings carved on rock of dinosaur-like creatures that have been found, which clearly testify then that men saw them living. Ken points out how scientists accept mammoth drawings in caves, but because of the evolutionary teaching, they do not accept the dinosaur depictions. And he includes a very impressive picture in his book which is easily recognizable as a dinosaur. But beyond that, there is physical evidence that makes the idea of 65 million years ago ridiculous, such as the T-Rex that scientists from the University of Montana found that were not only not totally fossilized, but sections of the bone were said to be like fresh bone and contain what seemed to be blood cells and hemoglobin. Now, this is clearly impossible for something that supposedly existed and went extinct 65 million years ago. And also, unfossilized duck-billed dinosaur bones have been found, and Ken Ham says on page 19 of his booklet, yet the bones could not have survived for millions of years unmineralized. This is a puzzle to those who believe in an age of dinosaurs millions of years ago, but not to someone who builds his thinking on the Bible. So true.
Sorry, brother, but we're running out of time, so you're going to have to speed it up.
Okay, thanks, brother. I'll try to talk as fast as I eat. That should get us through it. That would do it. Now, it's said that the average sized dinosaur, based on the skeletons found all over the earth, is about the size of a sheep. Not all of them grew to such a great size. And it's interesting that, to quote Ken Ham again, reptiles have the potential to grow as long as they live. Now, since we know there was a time when man lived to great ages upon the earth, like Methuselah, who lived to be 969 years old, imagine the size of a dinosaur living such a long time with the capability to grow its entire life.
Don, we've only got a few moments left. What's in store for the second half of this two-part series next week?
Well, in the second half, we'll still be covering some powerful evidence from science which reveals creation, especially concerning DNA and mutations. But the heart of the second half is especially designed to show the Christian, especially the minister, why the Bible and evolution are completely incompatible. Truly, such a belief is irreconcilable with biblical revelation, even contradicting crucial revelation concerning salvation in Christ to Adam's fallen line.
Well, I'm sure that many listening will want to hear that next week. Let me remind the listener that we can be found on the web at www.aholycalling.com. And there you can catch both Part 1 and Part 2 of this series and download it, as well as print off the notes that go along with it. These well-done notes are designed to be, in conjunction with the broadcast, a helpful reference resource for those who will be teaching others. And as long as we can do so, all the materials are free. However, if you would like to donate to support this ministry, you can do that online, or you can write to us at A Holy Calling, 880 Seabird Drive, Bandon, Oregon, 97411. And that address can be found online. Until next time, I'm your host, Jim Minkler, for Don Minkler and A Holy Calling Ministry, reminding you to keep looking to Him who has saved us and called us with a holy calling, not according to our works, but according to His own purpose and grace, which was given to us in Christ Jesus before time began.